Favorite set of dice or individual die. So the polyhedral dice that you use in Dungeons and Dragons, they predate Dungeons and Dragons. They didn't invent those dice. I know the shapes go back thousands of years. The regular polyhedrons are ancient, but as far as using them as random number generators, that predates D&D. They were in use in war games and various other aspects, and that's why D&D utilized them, is because they existed and you could buy sets of plastic polyhedrals. You have your tetrahedron, your cube or hexahedron. I don't know if it's a hexahedron. Tetrahedron, octahedron, decahedron, dodecahedron, and icosahedron are your standard 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 20-sided die. You also, thanks to games like DCC RPG, making them more, more well-known, more prevalent. There are D3s, D5s, D7s, D9s, D13s, D30, which is what you see right here. Rare but pointless, as the caption reads. My favorite die. Probably... Well, let's go by process of elimination. I'm not a big fan of D4s. They're awesome in that they have the little caltrop shape, and they suck if you ever drop one and forget about it and step on it. D4s to this day have rounded tips. There is a set of dice, and I'll talk about them in just a moment, called science dice. They're not the only ones, but that's the one I know of, that are where they completely clip the tips of the pyramid off, so that it's even more than rounded when you look at the D4s. But nobody likes rolling D4s. There's not enough numbers. They don't really roll that well. I don't like D4s. D8s are fun. That's longsword damage. D10s are kind of fun because that's bastard sword or dwarven war axe damage. D12s are the forgotten die. If you buy a set of dice and the only one you're missing is a D12, you're gonna be just fine. It's only really used for for barbarian hit points and the great axe for damage. And of course, the D20 is the mainstay of most, of course, D20 role-playing, but also Dungeons and Dragons. The D20 is the main die. Even when you get back to basic, where all weapons deal a D6 damage, and every class has D6 hit points, and you use 3D6 in order to roll your ability scores, you still use a D20 for attacks and saving throws. It's a very nice die. They allow you to calculate numbers of different percentages. Your D4 is, of course, 25%. Your D6 is about 18%. Your D8 is about 12%. D10 is, of course, 10%. D12 is then 8%. And D20 is 5%. You can have these little increments. And then, of course, 2D10 allow you to roll percentiles, which gives you a number from 1 to 100. So that actually gets you down to a 1% interval. I have a hard time saying that I don't like D20 as my favorite die, because it's the one that you roll in D&D to pretty much do everything. And it's fun to do everything. But at the same time, a D6 is 1, the most common die, 2, the most well-known die, 3, and this is probably the sticking point for me, it has pips instead of numbers. I do not like and cannot stand D6s with numbers on them. A D6 should have pips. Another pet peeve of mine with dice is that your die should be readable from across the table. I do not like I don't want to say the people. I do not like dice where the numbers aren't inked so that you can't see them. These are inked. You can see that there's a color of the die and a completely different color, highly contrasting color in the numbers. So those numbers, you can read those from across the table. The only issue with a D30 is kind of figuring out which number is facing up. because the faces are so flat. I say flat. The die is so rounded that it's difficult to tell which one might be facing up from an angle, like across the table. But the numbers need to be inked. They need to be inked in a color that is highly contrasting with the color of the die. I have seen people with dark colored dice that have black ink in them, and you can't tell what the number is. And it's annoying. And there's also the translucent dice, the transparent dice, the ones that are see-through, and if they are not inked, or if they're not inked particularly well, they are also impossible to read. If you're on the player side, they're kind of called, they're not called, but they're kind of cheaty dice, because you can roll the die in plain sight of everyone, but since no one can really read what the die says unless they're right there and they go to pick it up and look at it, you can just make up whatever number you want. So I really don't like dice that you cannot read it from across the table. I think it should be obvious and just right off the bat what the number is. That also goes for those dice that they sell nowadays that have all kinds of fancy designs on them, and especially the dice where they replace a number with a symbol. But a number is a symbol, that's true, but the numbers, the Arabic numerals, or the pips that we use are very well known. It's a shared language that we can expect anyone to know at the table. But for example, I have a die from Gen Con. If you watch my Gen Con videos, I show off some of the swag that I get while I was there. And one of them is a little gray die. Now, this little gray die, it's a D6, and it violates both rules in that I don't believe it's inked at all. Or if it is inked, it's very low contrast. So you can't read the numbers. Even though it's got pips on it, you can't read them very well. And 2, the 6 side of the die has been replaced with the Gen Con logo. Now, the Gen Con logo, normally when I think of a single logo on the die, I think of a 1, particularly for a D6, because a 1 is 1 pip in the middle, so one symbol on that side should be a 1. But no, this one's a 6. Now, they kind of get away with it in that there's 2 big pillars behind Gen Con on the symbol. And those kind of symbolize the 2 rows of pips that you would have on a D6 for the 6 side. But no. People also have D20s that have a symbol in place of the 20. And I don't like that. Especially because it violates part of my rule of that I should be able to read what it says from across the table. And a symbol, some weird symbol like these dwarven runes or these elvish script, or I know they make them for Call of Cthulhu with like all these Cthulhu-esque arcane symbols on the die. It gets in the way. I don't like them. So I think dice should be easy to see, easy to read, and I think D6s need pips. So a D6 with pips, probably my favorite die. In fact, it has to be a transparent D6 with pips. I'm okay with the white dice with the black pips on them. That's fine. But for example, a Vegas style die where it's the transparent red plastic with the white pips, that's my favorite. And if you've never been to Vegas, in Vegas, dice are sharp. You stack dice together and you get one giant solid block. They fit together perfectly. It's like they had a big hunk of plastic and they laser... In fact, this is exactly how it works. They have a big hunk of plastic and they laser cut the dice out of the plastic. That laser cut makes the dice super accurate in size and shape. Dice that we use when we play role-playing games are injection molded. I think it's injection molded, but they come out of a mold. I'm going to say injection molded because I think it describes the process, even if maybe technically it's not correct. There's a mold for each of the dice. They stick the nozzle in, they inject it with plastic, it fills out, then after it hardens, they pull the mold off, and there's a little... there's a bit of sprue that's on the dice as well, so they have to clip that off. Then, most game companies that sell dice put their dice in a roller, and it tumbles all the dice together with an abrasive. And that abrasive rounds the edges. You can kind of see on this die how the edges between the faces are rounded. These are not hard-cut, straight, sharp edges between the different faces of the die. Well, that rounding comes from rolling them in the rollers with the abrasives. That's also how they paint the die. They paint the die one color, like this white, inside all of the little numbers. Basically, they paint the whole die white, and it gets down into all of the etched numbers. I say etched, it actually is from the mold, but it doesn't matter. Then they roll the die in the roller with the abrasive, and all of the paint gets stripped away except for the paint that's inside the numbers. All the rest of the surface is exposed, so all that paint gets stripped off. Then they repaint the die with the other color, and you end up with this. That is how the process has been explained to me, so I can't vouch that I've seen this in practice. However, as I just mentioned, when they roll it around with the abrasives, it rounds the edges of the die. And when you round the edges of the die, there's no guarantee that all the edges are going to get rounded to the exact same degree and worn away to the exact same degree. There's a video on YouTube, and if I can remember, I will post a link to it, that it's got Mr. Zaki, and he's the guy who sells Zaki dice, or science dice. The Zaki dice are the weird dice that DCC RPG uses, the 3, 5, 7, whatever. He had a display that he would set up at Gen Con where he would stack D20s. So he would buy like 20 D20s from different dice vendors. And if you stacked them up on one set of faces, for example, 1 and 20, most people know that if you take a D6, the opposite sides of the D6 add up to 7. So 6 and 1 are opposite, 4 and 3, 5 and 2. Most good game companies do the same thing with all of their dice. And so for on a D20, 1 and 20 are on opposite sides, and then 2 and 19, 3 and 18, etc., etc. So he stacked all the dice up on the 1 and the 20, and then on the 7, 14. And when you stack them all on the 1 and 20, it reaches height X. And when you stack them all on the 7, 14, it reaches height Y. And X is greater than Y. The dice actually aren't round. They're oblong. They're kind of agate-shaped or almond-shaped or oval. And it affects what random numbers you roll. You're much more likely to roll a 7 or a 14 because that's in the middle edge of the oblong shape than you are to roll a 1 or a 20 because those are on the peaks of that oblong shape. Science dice that Mr. Zaki makes are not rolled, and they're not painted the same way. They come out of that injection mold, and they're sharp edges all around, and all they do is clip off the one piece of sprue, which happens to be on the 7 face, and that's it. And then they ink in the numbers. You have to pay extra for them to ink in the numbers because they ink them all by hand, and which is harder than doing it this way. But science dice are true. Well, they're more true random than these rolled dice because they're not different. When he has those 20 dice from the competitors stacked up on the different faces, you can see that they're different heights. But when he stacks up his own dice on the same faces, they're the same height all the way across. There is some variance. There's, a tiny bit of variance, but it's not as significant. However, there was someone who did a test. Now, the thing is, with that little bit of sprue on the 7, if they clip it and they don't clip it exactly flat, that means there's a slight bump on the 7. And that means the 7 can't really be face down. And opposite of the 7 is the 14. So you're less likely to roll a 14 with science dice unless that 7 is sanded and clipped down exactly flat. And someone actually, he was a teacher, and he got his students to roll dice 10,000 times for him. They had like a big bucket of dice, and they just rolled them all at once and tallied up the numbers and stuff like that. But he found out that, no, they're not exactly truly random. There wasn't a perfect distribution across the 100,000 some rolls that they did. but it was much more randomly distributed or even between all 20 numbers than regular gaming dice. So my favorite set of dice is my science dice set that I have. They're translucent blue, but they're inked with white numbers, so you can totally see them from across the table. And I have lost them. I went looking for them so that I could take a picture or something and show them to you, but I don't have them with me. They may very well be back home in Arizona, but I don't have them in my dice bag here. But until next time, bye-bye.